Raise your hand if you ever wanted to own a Fuji Frontier scanner yourself. Also raise your hand when you realize that owning a Fuji Frontier scanner yourself is pretty much impossible. If this is you, you came to the right video, because in all honesty, the Fuji Frontier scanner can be considered somewhat of a gold standard when it comes to film scanning. The fast scanning times, the incredibly beautiful tones and contrasts explain why so many professional labs actually use a Fuji Frontier. However, there are a couple of downsides to the Fuji Frontier. Firstly, that they are very hard to find and spare parts are even harder to source in case something breaks. Secondly, the software behind them is pretty outdated. You need an old Windows PC with Windows 2000 to actually keep them running. And thirdly, they are as huge as a piece of furniture. All that taken into account explains why the Fuji Frontier remains somewhat of a staple piece for professional labs, but make it pretty inaccessible for the film photography enthusiast who wants to bump up their scanning game. So just imagine there would be a solution that is just as automated and fast as the Fuji Frontier, with similarly beautiful colors, but that is accessible to everybody. Well, good news, because there is, and in this video I will tell you all about it. So yes, in this video I'm going to show you how to get lab quality results at home with this setup here. This is the Autocarrier 135 by Filmomat and Bobach. More than just this, in combination with the copy stand, the smartconvert software and the control panels, this can be understood as an entire automated workflow that basically turns your digital camera into a mock-up Fuji Frontier. In this video I'm going to show you how I use the setup, talk about the advantages and why I think that this is the closest a home scanning setup will come to actual lab scans, but also talk about some things to consider before buying. For full transparency, the guys over at Filmomat and Made by Bobach have sent me all this equipment, so I was able to try it out in my own pace over the last couple of months. Sorry guys again that this video took so long to make, but this video is not sponsored by them and everything I say is my own opinion. And the brains behind this beautiful setup is a duo from Munich in Germany who are creating innovative and high quality products for the film photography world. For one, we have Jules, who is behind Made by Bobach, and we have Lukas behind Filmomat, who are collaborating on the hardware and the software of this setup. So, how does this setup actually work? Firstly, it's important to mention that this is a camera scanning setup, so you will need a camera and a macro lens of your choice to actually take photos of your negatives. I've used several setups for film scanning in the past and they all have one thing in common. You have a set of film holders, feed your film through manually, take photos of your negatives and later convert them as a second part of the workflow. This here works a bit differently though, because the film is scanned and converted at the same time, which kind of resembles how a Fuji Frontier would actually do it. The centerpiece of this workflow is the Autocarrier 135 itself, and the name already describes its function pretty perfectly. The Autocarrier is a device that automatically carries an entire roll of film through by automatically recognizing the spacing in between the frames. That way, an entire roll of film is transported through the film holder quickly, automatically taking a photo of each frame without the necessity to wind and trigger your camera manually. It has this integrated pressure plate that ensures that your film is held perfectly flat, automatically rising and lowering the pressure plate as it works its way through the film. I have the Autocarrier 135 here for 35mm film, but they also came out with an Autocarrier 120 version for medium format film. By the way, the Autocarrier comes with its own control panel that lets you control the settings with this very cool looking device. Besides the switch to turn the light on and off and the manual control for the pressure plate, you also have this knob with 3 modes you can choose from: manual, semi and auto, which I will tell you about in a second. You can also choose the film speed the film shall be scanned through from 1 frame to 3 frames per second, which is actually so fast that it gave me trust issues the first time I saw it. The manual mode lets you do the scanning manually, so you go to the first frame and work your way through the film in your own pace by using this incredibly smooth hi-fi looking knob. Seriously, this wheel is probably the smoothest operating device I've ever used, and I think getting the setup is worth it just alone for this wheel. The manual mode is nice to have, especially if you have a weirdly exposed negative where you want to or have to do it yourself because you cannot really recognize the film borders. But overall, I haven't really used it much because I think that the whole point of the setup is that it's automated and you don't have to do the work yourself. And this is where the auto mode actually comes in, where you can lean back and let this device do the work for you. It's as simple as that. You just feed in your film and the carrier automatically recognizes the first frame where you can make tweaks to its exact position. After you press the camera button, it will go through the entire roll by itself, and this is the key feature that makes this piece of equipment so interesting. Basically how it works is that the sensor inside of the carrier recognizes the bright lines of the film borders and therefore knows where to stop for each of the individual frames. In the past, people have complained about having problems with wrong alignment on the auto mode because the Autocarrier would sometimes get confused if there was a bright strip of exposure in the middle of the frame, accidentally thinking that this is the film border. However, this was corrected by a software update, and I personally didn't run into this issue on any of the rolls I've scanned. Also, another new feature called fallback mode was added to the auto mode, which makes it even more fail-safe. In case 2 frames in a row were not recognized by the carrier, it stops scanning and makes a sound so that you know that the frame hasn't been recognized properly. Now you can adjust the frame yourself and reactivate the auto mode by pressing the camera button again. This way, missing frames don't have to be identified and rescanned later, also keeping the order of your digital files the correct way in your scanned folder. So yeah, it's still good to have a safety net in the auto mode, especially in case you're working with thinly exposed negatives. There is also a third mode called the semi-mode, where a combination of manual adjustments and auto spacing is used. You feed in your roll and manually take pictures of the first 2 frames so that the Autocarrier can use the spacing between the frames as an information to calculate the upcoming frame distances to consider. I personally just stuck to auto mode, but it certainly is great to have a manual and semi-manual mode for more tricky rolls. So what this Autocarrier does is to feed the entire film through in an impressively fast pace, eliminating the problem that most camera scanning setups have, that you need to photograph every frame individually by hand. But there are some more pieces that round up this workflow and turn this into a truly fully automated system similar to the Fuji Frontier. One of it being what actually happens after the images have been scanned, or in this case, during. Most of you might know Negative Lab Pro, which is a Lightroom plugin that lets you convert your negatives into positives. While it is amazing and gives you incredible results, it's another manual step because you have to import your frames into Lightroom and prepare the scans for conversion, as for example crop them and set the white balance. To overcome this, part of the Filmomat workflow is to use another software which is called smartconvert, which will actually start converting your negatives while you are scanning. Yes, not after, but while. For that, you need to tether your camera to the computer and create a so-called hot folder where the images are imported into smartconvert in real time. So while your roll is still feeding through, the images are automatically imported into smartconvert, converted straight away so that you see your positive the second it's scanned, and you can already make adjustments while the Autocarrier is still scanning the rest of your roll. This software is rather simple and minimalistic, and this is the whole point of it. You only have contrast, density and saturation and the 3 color channels to adjust your images. So the options are a bit more limited in comparison to something like Negative Lab Pro, where you have entire profiles and curves, which means that you cannot get as detailed and precise with your adjustments. But for somebody like me who quickly gets overwhelmed by too many options and who also gets kind of blind by staring at an image for too long, it's actually quite useful to just stick to the basics. Especially because in my experience the initial conversion with smartconvert is actually quite good and there aren't as many adjustments that I usually do to the initial conversion. Other advantages are that it has auto crop so that you don't have to manually crop each image, which for me only work more or less reliably. Also, you can batch process your images from an entire roll, so if you make all the edits to the first frame of the roll, you can just copy the settings to all the other frames. Even more than that, you have advanced settings where you can apply a flat field correction, which means that any imperfections from your camera or the lens or the light source can be corrected for. To do that, you just take one image before inserting the film and things like a vignette will automatically be edited out. What I found to be the most fun and the most enjoyable about this whole process though is this here, the smartconvert control panel. It looks similar to the control panel that is built into the Fuji Frontier and lets you make the adjustments with the physical device and not the keypad of your laptop. To be clear, this is not necessary to have. You can also just stick to the keyboard of your laptop to dial in your settings. But as somebody who loves analog things, there's just something to having a physical device and actually be able to play around with the buttons in this tactile experience. And in all honesty, it just makes me feel like I'm an actual lab rat working at a film lab. Also, as an honorable mention, even though it's not essential to this workflow, Jules has also sent me the 340 Pro copy stand, which basically is an incredibly well-built, fine precision stand to mount your camera on while scanning. In the past, I've used tripods and a simple copy stand, which works well besides being a bit fiddly, but this here is a true game changer to have optimal stability and to be able to fine-tune the alignment of your camera to make sure that your sensor is 100% parallel to the film plane. So if you're already investing in a high-quality professional scanning setup like the Autocarrier, in my opinion, having a proper copy stand kind of rounds up the entire setup. This one is the smaller version, the 340 Pro, but a taller version, the 540 Pro, also exists. I've shown you all the individual components, but now let's actually see how this entire workflow looks like in action. The Autocarrier is attached to its control panel. I have the Autocarrier also connected to my camera via an audio cable, and my camera is tethered to my laptop via USB-C, and the smart convert panel is connected to my computer as well. So yeah, it's a bit of a cable salad, as we say in German, but once you figured out what goes where and is connected to which device, it's actually rather simple. Firstly, I will make sure to focus on my film and dial in all of the settings in my camera so that I don't have to touch any of it later and can leave everything as it is. To focus, I set the carrier to manual mode, feed in the film and go to the first frame. Then I activate the pressure plate so that the film is in the position it will later be in while scanning, and I focus on the grain. I then stop down my lens to f8, leave my ISO at base ISO of the camera or as low as possible, and am ready to start. Then I open Smart Convert and make sure that I have these two settings dialed in. Firstly, I choose a hot folder. As a hot folder, I want to choose the folder that my camera is automatically transferring the images to. And before I start scanning, I will actually rewind the film again to take a photo of the light source without any film in it, which will act as my correction image to get all the imperfections from the lens, camera and light source out. And now I can start scanning, and I set my Autocarrier to auto mode, and I personally leave it at 1 to maximum 2 frames per second because this is more than fast enough for me, and I can lean back and watch the magic happen. And while the Autocarrier is feeding the film through, all of the images are automatically imported into the hot folder in Smart Convert. So while the Autocarrier is doing its work, I can actually start sourcing through my images and make the first adjustments. In fact, I usually only edit one image and I make all the adjustments to that one image and copy the settings to all other images of the roll. And just like that, an entire roll of film isn't only scanned but also converted within just a few minutes, making this truly the most efficient, most fast and most professional scanning setup I've ever used. And here are some of the results I got with the Autocarrier in combination with Smart Convert. Since most of you might be familiar with Negative Lab Pro, I decided to actually invert the same image twice, once with Smart Convert and once with Negative Lab Pro, so that we can get an idea about the differences. However, if you would like me to make a dedicated video about the comparison between Negative Lab Pro and Smart Convert, definitely let me know in the comments down below. Now that you've seen some of the results of the setup, let's also talk about some of the pros and the cons to it. One of the biggest benefits of the Filmomat workflow, in my opinion, is pretty obvious because it is the speed and the efficiency you can get. Within minutes, you don't only scan in your film, but you also have converted positives so that you can work with your files pretty much straight away within minutes and get amazing results with very minimal labor because you can lean back for the majority of the process. And I honestly think this is as fast and as efficient as it can get for a home scanning setup. Secondly, for me, it has to be the tactile quality of this workflow. As a film nerd, you might relate to the idea that the outcome isn't everything, but the process is also what counts. And I love analog photography because there's this tactile experience that I get from it. And in the setup, since there are so many buttons and wheels and knobs and dedicated devices, it kind of gives me a little bit of that feeling that I'm actually doing something analog, dedicated, and not something that's just happening on my computer. And also all the knobs and all the dials just feel amazing, so it's just a lot of fun. For example, I don't really use the manual mode at all, but I sometimes switch to it just because I enjoy using the control panel so much that it's just fun to play around with. So the tactile experience for me personally is a big pro that I didn't really see in many other of the scanning solutions so far. And thirdly, it's the build quality. With every device I've shown you in this video, you can just see and feel that these were built with extremely high precision out of high quality materials and that these things were built to last. Especially if we compare the Filmomat and Bobach devices to something like the old Fuji Frontiers, which are getting old and are starting to break, it's kind of nice to know that you have something that hopefully will survive the next couple of years, especially because Jules and Lukas are constantly working on new editions and new solutions. I would be very optimistic that support and service will be available for a while to come. When we talk about the downsides of the setup, there's one thing in particular that might strike you, which is the price, because this setup is not particularly cheap. The price for the Autocarrier 135 is 1,749 euros. smartconvert itself will cost you 199 euros, and for the smartconvert control panel, it will book you in at another 299 euros. If you want to go for the Pro copy stand, which is optional but honestly a game changer, this will cost you another 1,299 euros. So in total, this setup would be 3,546 euros, which sounds crazy, but honestly, I would have almost expected more. If we compare this price to the Fuji Frontier, it actually is still a little bit cheaper than that. At the time when I was researching, there were no Fuji Frontiers listed, so they are very hard to find in the first place. But the ones that I have found that have been sold before were more in the 5,000 euros region. And if a part of the Fuji Frontier breaks, it will easily be another couple hundreds, if not 1,000 euros, just to make it work. So if we compare that, it isn't too bad, even though we of course have to add that a camera and a lens is not included in that price. However, I also think that it's very hard to compare used market prices of old devices that are over 20 years old with something that's just new on the market now. So if we actually compare the prices of the Fuji Frontier from back then and convert it to today's standards, the Fuji Frontier would actually be more expensive than the Filmomat workflow today. I also think it depends on which perspective you look at it from. If you're a private person who's shooting film for fun, yes, this is like an exorbitant high amount of an expense to do just to scan in your film, and this is probably not sustainable for most of us. If you're looking at the perspective from a film lab, this is actually a very cheap price for a very solid setup. The second downside I would mention is that the initial setup takes time and is very dependent on your camera. I personally use the Fujifilm X-S20 and I had some starting problems because I couldn't get the setup to work in the beginning. I was honestly a little bit overwhelmed with all the cables and things to connect, but one thing in particular kind of didn't want to work because you need an aux cable to connect the camera to the Autocarrier in my case. And whatever cable I used, even though I had 500 of these lying around my apartment, none of them worked and I was a bit frustrated. Luckily, the guys from Filmomat and Bobach helped me out and jumped on a video call to help me find the right equipment that I need, which was definitely a lifesaver. But I think for people who are not as familiar with the whole process of tethering your camera, it can be a bit overwhelming to see so many devices and cables and not really know what to connect how. So I think it would be nice to have some sort of roadmap or guidance, or just like an overview over how the individual components are connected to make the setup work. Last but not least, probably the biggest downside to the setup are dust issues. This is nothing that's only specific to this setup, but this actually is applicable to all camera scanning setups, because with camera scanning you don't have the option for automatical dust removal. With something like the Fuji Frontier that has an infrared dust detection, the dust and specks are automatically recognized and removed for you, which is not possible with a camera. Therefore, you do have to do it yourself and import your images into Lightroom or Photoshop to do it manually, which kind of defeats the purpose of having a fully automated setup where you can work with the end result straight away. However, Filmomat also came out with a solution for that, because they offer an infrared-ready autocarrier system with specially modified cameras that can get rid of the dust within the smartconvert software. How it works is that the carrier has two integrated light sources, a normal and an infrared light source. The modified camera will take two images of the negative, and the software can automatically remove dust and specks. I didn't try out the infrared modified setup, but honestly this sounds like a perfect solution for the dust problem. However, due to the price tag, this is probably only of interest for film labs and not somebody like me. For me personally, this setup is pretty much perfect already, but one thing I will probably get in the long term, and that is a lens adapter that comes with its own tripod mount. Because if I own that, I can basically leave my macro lens on the Pro stand the entire time and just attach my camera when I'm ready to scan, so that I don't have to do all the readjustments and rebalancing and refocusing every time again. So this is probably an investment that I will do in the future to further improve the setup. So what is my verdict? In my opinion, this is the one scanning setup that doesn't only give you the speed and the quality, but also the tactile experience a lab could offer you. It is incredibly fast, it is incredibly satisfying and enjoyable to use, and it's also new and modern, which means that there's less of a likelihood for it to break anytime soon. However, it does come with a bit of a premium price tag, so if you are a pro photographer or an enthusiast who doesn't care about the expenses but just wants to have the best of the best quality, this might be interesting for you. But mostly I think this is a very, very attractive option for film labs who might have an easier time to justify the expenses and also maybe have a harder time to find something like a Fuji Frontier for the lab setup. However, if this is out of your budget, don't worry, this is very understandable. If you're interested to learn about alternatives and maybe more budget-friendly options to scan in your film, definitely check out some of the older videos on my channel, because I've showcased a couple of different methods to do so. Well, once again, thank you to Filmomat and Bobach for this incredible opportunity and all the help along the way to bump up my scanning game to a very professional level now. And that being said, also thank you for watching and see you in the next episode.